Good morning and welcome to 7 at 7 from the Economic Times podcasts, a daily financial news capsule to get you clued in for the day. It's Monday, the 7th of October, and I am your host, Bhaskar Datta. Ahead of the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks by Hamas on Israel, the country carried out strikes in Lebanon and the Gaza Strip, with the Israeli defense minister saying that all options were on the table for retaliation against Iran, Global Reports said. Remember, last week Iran had launched a massive campaign of missile strikes on Israel in response to the latter's attacks against militant group Hezbollah. According to a Reuters report, as the West Asia crisis nears its first anniversary, demonstrators protested against Israel's military campaign around the world, from Jakarta to Istanbul, following rallies in major European capitals, Washington and New York on Saturday. Tens of thousands have died in the war, while the disruptions to supply chains pose risks of economic distress around the world, as prices of global commodities such as crude oil shoot up. Remember how markets around the world celebrated when the US Fed cut interest rates last month and gave projections of further cuts going ahead? Well, the latest employment data from the world's largest economy seems to have thrown a spanner in the works for investors positioning for large US rate cuts. Data released after Indian market hours on Friday showed that US non-farm payrolls rose by 254,000 in August, a much larger jobs addition than market expectations of around 140,000. This was the largest increase in 6 months, and as such weakens the case for the Fed to carry out large rate cuts to support the economy. The Fed is now expected to cut rates by 25 basis points next month, as against earlier hopes that the US Central Bank would repeat September's 50 basis point rate cut. Along with the risk aversion sparked by the West Asian crisis, the data is likely to lead to a stronger dollar, exerting pressure on EM currencies like the rupee, which is already hovering around record lows versus the US currency. On the domestic front, the Reserve Bank of India will detail its all-important interest rate statement this week, with the developments in West Asia casting a shadow over the policy review. According to an ET poll of 10 respondents, the RBI is seen keeping the repo rate unchanged at the statement on Wednesday, as the central bank's Monetary Policy Committee is likely to assess the durability of recent declines in inflation, while keeping a wary eye on escalating tensions in West Asia, which pose risks to local price pressures. The repo rate is the rate at which the RBI lends to banks and determines borrowing costs across the economy. Here's a scoop from corporate India. The Adani Group has started talks to acquire the Indian cement operations of Germany's Heidelberg Materials, ET has learned. The proposed buyout of Heidelberg's India unit will be led by Adani Group company Ambuja Cements and could be worth around $1.2 billion. The Adani Group, India's second biggest cement maker, had entered the sector by acquiring Holcim's India operations in 2022. As with Holcim, Adani intends to move fast to close the deal. Turning to a crucial public health issue, India's leading drug makers have urged the Supreme Court to empower police and drug inspectors to conduct investigations against those suspected of manufacturing counterfeit drugs. In a petition filed last week, the Indian Pharmaceutical Alliance, a grouping of 23 leading Indian drug makers, urged the top court to direct the Health Ministry to formulate guidelines for filing of FIRs and procedure for arrest of those selling and manufacturing counterfeit drugs, both of which are punishable under the Drugs and Cosmetic Act 1940. Let's talk trade. The next round of talks for an India-EU free trade agreement could be held in the first quarter of 2025, when the two sides are expected to build on the limited progress made on issues such as rules of origin and government procurement, according to officials. In the area of government procurement, the ninth round of talks from September 23rd to 27th failed to resolve certain issues related to state-owned enterprises, Make in India, and its application to EU bidders and goods. India and the EU relaunched negotiations for an FTA after a 9-year hiatus and started separate negotiations for an investment protection agreement and an agreement on geographical indications in June 2022. We end with news from the automobile sector, an area which faces significant disruptions from the push towards a renewable energy shift. Mahindra & Mahindra will be ready to launch its first petrol hybrid model in 2026, seeking to claim a stake in the small but fast expanding segment that's currently dominated by Toyota Kirloskar Motor, and Maruti Suzuki. Demand for hybrid cars has been growing, owing to superior fuel efficiency compared to traditional internal combustion engine powered models and non dependence on charging infrastructure. That's all for today. Thank you very much for tuning into 7 at 7 from the Economic Times podcasts.